Good evening. Jürgen, thank you so much, and thanks to the FPA in London, thank you to our sponsors, and thank you, all of you, for coming out on the Germany-England night to be here with all of us. I have been in London for 3 months now, and I'm adjusting pretty well, I hope, but I have to admit, and I'm not afraid to admit, that my first experiences with the press corps caught me slightly off guard. Now, in fairness, I was warned. A great Londoner living in New York warned me before I came over to London. And he said, look, the press will build you up and then tear you down. Beware. Literally, the next day, a story appears in a London paper about my becoming ambassador, in which I am described as, and I quote, a potato with hair. Needless to say, I am bracing myself for the tearing down bit. My next brush with the press came exactly 6 days after I arrived here in London, which happened to coincide with the day that Parliament voted against the government motion on Syria. I awoke the next morning to this. A death notice in a major paper, widely read, and I'll read to you from it in case you missed that day. Death notice. The special relationship died at home after a sudden illness on Thursday, August 29, 2013, aged 67. Beloved offspring of Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Funeral to be held at the French Embassy. The next day, I got an email from a friend saying, well done, Matthew. It took 7 decades to build this special relationship, and you have managed to break it in less than 7 days. So it hasn't been overly dull. I'm trying to learn British understatement. But in fairness, the questions I actually get from reporters come up because there are plenty of difficult and legitimate issues that require questioning and debate. Syria, Middle East peace, Iran, the transatlantic trade and investment deal, climate change, and the NSA disclosures. This last one is obviously a serious topic of great concern to many people. But it did lead to a humorous moment in my office a few days ago. I was with my team going over remarks that I was going to say to a group of university students up in Edinburgh. And I wanted to open with one of my favorite anecdotes about the first bit of diplomatic advice I was ever given by President Obama. They're familiar with the story. I say it a lot. But this time, my staff looked awkwardly down at their feet and then politely warned me off the story, given recent headlines. Here's how the story goes, and see if you can understand their anxiety. Before I went to Sweden, where I did my first go-round as ambassador, I was fortunate enough to sit with President Obama in the Oval Office, and I asked him if he had any advice for a first-time diplomat. He did, and it was just one word: listen. In all seriousness, a robust discussion about balancing privacy and protection is something that I welcome. It is something President Obama welcomes. And listening to concerns of friends and allies and civil liberties groups is a big part of that. It's a debate we need to have, and the press, of course, is not only the public square where much of this debate will happen, but it is also an active participant in that debate. But I didn't come here on a night of great celebration in this magical city that I am fortunate enough to call my home away from home, to talk about tensions between diplomats and reporters. I actually want to talk about the opposite. I want to talk about something we have in common, namely words. The stock and trade for reporters, journalists generally, and certainly diplomats. And what a date to talk about words. Today is the 150th anniversary of President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, probably the most exceptional example of the power of words well chosen. As Lincoln knew, good writing and the thinking that careful use of words requires does more than just clarify and persuade. It actually can be an act of benevolence, a force for good in the world, which is the main point that I want to make tonight. I think you'll all agree that we live in an overwhelming time, but especially when it comes to words. The former executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, made the point earlier this month, explaining that for foreign news junkies like him, there is a great feast of foreign reporting because he knows where to find it. But he's concerned that for the average reader, this abundance of often unfiltered information can, as he puts it, overwhelm without informing. Overwhelming without informing is a concept not unknown to the diplomatic community either, but we experience, however, an alternative but related problem: underwhelming without informing. We've all heard those wonderful definitions of a diplomat: someone who thinks twice before saying nothing, or someone who can always make themselves misunderstood. There's some truth in those descriptions. Recently, I was talking to a friend who also serves as an ambassador in Europe, and he told me that after a recent appearance on a show that's kind of the equivalent of the Andrew Marr show over where he is, he got a call from a colleague after the show saying, "You did a great job saying nothing." It was meant, of course, as a compliment and taken as one. We're also sometimes slow to realize when words have gone from well-worn to worn out. One phrase that comes to mind, and it comes up a lot in my job, is, "There's no daylight between us." Once meant as a tough-talking exaggeration for effect, its overuse has somehow set kind of a preposterous standard of agreement. Think about the image: no daylight. Certainly in the context of the special relationship, it seems odd. I think about and I picture in my mind the statue of FDR and Churchill on the bench in Bond Street. Do you know that one? The two of them in animated conversation with plenty of room between them for someone else and for their big personalities. Imagine how odd it would be if they were so close that no daylight could get between them and they were some monolithic blob. That relationship wouldn't be special. It would be creepy. And here's another one. The way, too much and too often, we say we need actions, not words, as if somehow they're mutually exclusive. Obviously, in cases like Iran, where conciliatory words have opened the door to progress slightly, they must be matched with actions that are both transparent and verifiable. But in other contexts, we repeatedly and almost unthinkingly use that same phrase as kind of a throwaway, making it sound like words never make a difference. But they do. There are occasions when words have good effects, bad effects, or no effect at all, just as there are times when actions have good effects, bad effects, and no effect at all. So both should be assessed by what they actually achieve, judged by their fruits. In diplomacy, we sometimes build these verbal prisons for ourselves. Through the official, dull, and I suppose benign, so-called talking points. You know what I mean. We draw them up in committees and windowless conference rooms, and when it finally comes time to actually say them out loud, you begin to wonder whether there's any point in talking. Someone I turn to in those moments, for whom words matter profoundly, is President Obama. It is sometimes forgotten that he, like many of you, is a writer. On a visit to the White House right before I came to London, I bumped into one of his speechwriters, and he showed me a legal pad on which the president had started an outline for an upcoming speech. He had written it by hand in his neat left-handed penmanship a few days before, late at night, and it was paragraph after uninterrupted paragraph of tight prose, of core logic building his argument. Even more impressive was when I got to see the computer printouts of a later version where he had gone back through what his team had written up and made line edits to every line. Every word was chosen with care, every word was needed, every word mattered. To me, the President's speech at the United Nations General Assembly this most recent September is a shining example of how good words can make a fundamental difference. The speech showed his concern with the careful use of words about the United States and our foreign policy, and how words affect perception and in turn shape major events. Here's a sampling that shows what I'm talking about. He says, and I quote, "The United States is chastised for meddling on the one hand and accused of having a hand in all manner of conspiracy. And at the same time, the United States is blamed for failing to do enough. I realize that some of this is inevitable, given America's role in the world, but these attitudes have a practical impact on the American people's support for our involvement. And the danger for the world is not an America that is eager to immerse itself in the affairs of other countries. The danger for the world is that the United States, after a decade of war, rightly concerned about issues back home, and aware of the hostility that our engagement has engendered, may disengage," end quote. Essentially, what he's saying is that because words matter, they have a practical impact in shaping not only attitudes towards Americans, but also Americans' attitudes towards the rest of the world. The President chooses his words with care, and he also wants others to do the same. Which brings me back to tonight and to this celebration. Tonight we are celebrating the best of carefully chosen words. Words in some cases delivered alongside brilliant images, which communicate with nuance, context, empathy, and insight. Words that have thrown light into some of the darkest corners, whether that's human rights abuses or humanitarian tragedy. Or uplifting words that have uncovered hopes of transformational breakthroughs in science and medicine. All these, for me, are fundamental acts of decency, of benevolence. This is words as a force for good. So I urge you, as you continue working with clarity, care, and conviction, and I encourage you to get others to follow your lead. Because the absence of nuance, context, and perspective can do serious damage. Our choice of words is also a choice about the conversation we want to have, and about the decisions and choices we make as a result. It is ultimately about what kind of world we want to live in. Events give us reason often to be cynical, but journalism, and I think diplomacy at its best too, have always been harbors for the ideals that underlie a better conversation, a better civilization. I'm so honored to be with you all here tonight, who are advancing the conversation with your experience, your perspective, and your intelligence. My deepest congratulations to everyone honored here tonight, and thank you so much for having me.